So the reading is from Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 through 16. It's a shorter gospel this week. And it says this: "You are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trodden underfoot by men. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hid. Nor do men light a lamp and put it under a bushel, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. Let your light so shine before men, that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven." Right, end of gospel. Okay, so let's look at each of these images separately. First, we'll begin with the salt of the earth. What does Jesus mean by calling his disciples the salt of the earth? Well, in the Old Testament, on several occasions, like in the book of Job, chapter 6, verse 6, salt is described as being used, like we use it today, to give food flavor, right? So if you want to add flavor to a food, you're going to put salt into the meal. And if you don't have any salt, the meal will be tasteless. It'll be bland. And that seems clearly to be the primary meaning here, because notice what Jesus is saying. If salt has lost its taste, how shall it be restored? In other words, it's not good for anything, and you would just throw it away. Now, there is a twist, though, here, and many people have pointed it out, and it's this. It's real simple. Is that real salt doesn't lose its flavor. It doesn't become unsalty. So this is a classic example, we'll see this throughout the Gospel of Matthew, of one of Jesus' parables or teachings where he'll have something that's kind of unexpected or a surprise or a little bit of a twist, like we just saw with the Beatitudes last week. Blessed are they, or happy are they who mourn. What? What are you doing? And Jesus uses this all the time to get our attention, to call our attention to some deeper truth that he's trying to illuminate here. So he's not talking about real salt. Real salt doesn't lose its flavor. If it did lose its flavor, however, what good would it be? It would be worthless, right? And it would just be worth throwing out and being trampled underfoot. So what Jesus is doing here is he's trying to point to the disciples, and he's using a metaphor. They are like salt, right? And they're meant to add something to the world, to add some kind of flavor to the world. And if they don't have it themselves, if they lose that saltiness themselves, they're worthless. They're not living up to who they're called to be as disciples of Jesus. Now, with that said, it's kind of a strange metaphor. It seems a little bit weird, unless you add a second dimension of meaning to it. Because in the Old Testament, salt is not simply used to refer to adding flavor to just any meal. In the book of Leviticus, it's very specifically described as adding flavor to a certain meal, namely the sacrifices in the temple. So if you go back to the book of Leviticus, chapter 2, verse 13, just for a second here, this isn't in the lectionary, but I think it's important background. In the book of Leviticus, chapter 2, verse 13, it says this, and I quote, it's describing how to prepare sacrifices in the tabernacle. And it says, quote, "You shall season all your cereal offerings with salt. You shall not let the salt of the covenant with your God be lacking from your cereal offering. With all your offerings you shall offer salt." That's Leviticus 2, verse 13. And we see the same thing in other passages in the Old Testament. So for example, in the book of Numbers, chapter 18, verse 19, it talks about the salt of the covenant. And in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 43, verse 24, it talks about how the priests, before they would offer a sacrifice, they would always sprinkle it with salt. Okay, if we go back to Leviticus chapter 2, verse 13, and we look at the context there, the kind of sacrifice that the salt is being added to is known as a cereal offering. Now, that can be misleading for an English reader, because when we think of cereal, we think of like a modern day breakfast cereal, think of your favorite cereal, Fruit Loops or Frosted Flakes or whatever it might be, Captain Crunch, whatever you're partial to. But obviously that's not what the book of Leviticus is talking about here. The cereal offering is a translation of the Hebrew word mincha, which literally means just a bread or a grain offering. So you had these cereal offerings that would often be offered to God in the form of a caked bread, usually sometimes mixed with oil, and interestingly, often um, offered on the altar with bread and wine. So as an offering of bread and wine. So it was kind of like a meal that you would share with God. So the salt is added to the cereal offering to signify the covenant banquet between you and God. It's something that's essential for a sacrifice that's being offered to the Lord, right? With all your offerings, you shall offer salt, Leviticus says. So there may be a deeper meaning going on when we go back to the Sermon on the Mount. A number of scholars have suggested this, that when Jesus refers to his disciples as the salt of the earth, he's not just talking about common everyday salt that's used to give flavor to an everyday meal, but that he's, in a sense, using this as a metaphor and likening them to the salt of the covenant sacrifices that would be offered to God in the temple. And this makes a lot of sense if we look at the rest of the New Testament, in which, for example, Romans 12, Paul's going to call the Christians in Rome to offer their bodies as a living sacrifice to the Lord. In other words, that the Christian vocation is not just to offer sacrifice to God, but to become a sacrificial offering to the Lord for the salvation of the world in union with Christ, who's going to offer himself as the ultimate sacrifice on the cross, and then the ultimate sacrifice in the true cereal offering, the bread offering of the Eucharist. So this is a really deep and rich metaphor that Jesus is using here, that the disciples are called to be the salt of the earth that's going to season the world so that the world itself, in a sense, might be offered up to God as a pleasing sacrifice, as a cereal offering that will bind him to the world in the new and everlasting covenant, right? So now, obviously, it's getting a little ahead of ourselves. We haven't gotten to the Last Supper and all that yet. But you can already see the seeds of that kind of sacrificial theology just in the very metaphor that Jesus is using here. You are the salt of the earth. Obviously, too, the negative dimension of that is that if the disciples themselves lose their quote-unquote saltiness, in other words, if they break covenant with God, if they don't remain faithful to God, then there's no way that they're going to be able to sanctify the world and bring the world to God as an offering to him in sacrifice and in the worship of the new covenant. So a lot hidden in a little with this saying here.